He betrayed our sacred vows by slipping back into the arms of an old flame, blaming my inability to conceive as if I were to blame for our empty womb, and now he's pleading for a return that feels more like a ransom than reconciliation. For context, I, 27 years old, and my 30-year-old husband have spent 2 tumultuous years bound by marriage, relentlessly chasing the dream of a child for the past 10 months. Each barren month only deepened the strain on our already fragile bond. In these recent days, the yearning for a baby pulsed like an unyielding drum in my heart, a shared dream from our earliest days of courtship, where whispers of a blossoming family united us, and it drove us to plunge headlong into the pursuit of conception right after our vows were exchanged. Though every test returned a disheartening void, I clung to fragile composure, while he erupted in bursts of anguish and retreated into silence for days, as if seclusion could patch the cracks in his failing hopes. Each of his outbursts painted me with guilt, silently accusing me of being solely responsible for our barren plight. Around 6 months in, I ventured to suggest that we seek answers through tests, for the recurring emptiness every month was a relentless torment that had him teetering on the edge. Yet, he brushed aside the idea, insisting that tests were but an unnecessary expense when sheer persistence was all we needed, so we trudged on, clinging to hope. Then, 3 weeks ago, after yet another test confirmed our disappointment, our simmering frustrations exploded. He snapped with a cruelty that chilled my very soul, insisting he already knew whose fault it was, though he claimed he'd shield my feelings from the harsh truth. It made no sense for him to cast me as the culprit for our infertility when no test had yet spoken its verdict, and that baseless accusation ignited a bitter quarrel between us. His words cut deeper than I ever expected, and I fired back by questioning his habit of pinning every failure on me, even when the fault might as well have been his. He countered with unyielding certainty that he was blameless, and then delivered a frigid ultimatum: either I take decisive action or we must part ways, since his dream of a baby rendered our union worthless if I couldn't deliver it. That cold decree shattered me. I had once believed our love could thrive even in the absence of a child, yet his heart seemed possessed solely by the desire for offspring, reducing me to a mere vessel for his dream rather than a cherished partner. Disillusionment seeped into my bones as I realized that this was exactly how he truly saw me, prompting me to silence my voice until an apology could mend the rift. But the apology never came. 3 days later, he departed on a business trip without even a farewell word. His silent departure cut deeper than any harsh word ever could, a final act of abandonment that stung like a lost goodbye. In the aftermath, I clung to a thin thread of solace, noting that at least he dutifully recorded his trip details on our shared calendar, a ritual that once comforted me now serving as a haunting reminder of his neglect. Determined to carry on despite the emptiness, I steeled myself for the long 10 days of his absence, even as my heart ached with each passing moment. Then, on the 3rd day of his trip, as I aimlessly scrolled through Instagram, a startling image seized my attention: his former lover, radiant in a bikini by a shimmering pool, set against a backdrop that struck an eerie familiarity. A hunch drove me to investigate the hotel where he claimed to be staying, and, to my dismay, the locale mirrored exactly the one I had seen on Google Maps just days before. Driven by a mix of dread and determination, I scrutinized every detail and even called the hotel's front desk, desperate to confirm if she truly occupied that space. Requesting to be connected to her room, I listened as her voice crackled over the line, repeatedly demanding to know who was calling. Then, swallowing my rising anxiety, I hung up without a word. I tried to banish the creeping dread from my mind, yet the evidence was irrefutable: my husband was entangled in an affair with his ex. Bitterly, I recognized that my vigilance on social media had, in a cruel twist of fate, become my unwitting savior, exposing a secret that might otherwise have remained shrouded in darkness. It dawned on me that perhaps his routine of logging travel details was mere habit, a relic of normalcy, rather than a calculated attempt to conceal his indiscretions. But fate had already unspooled the truth. My suspicions crystallized when, mere moments after that damning post appeared, the calendar entries evaporated into thin air. Too late, for I had already preserved the evidence with a screenshot, a silent testament to betrayal. They had once shared a 2-year romance during college, a connection that faded a few months before graduation, yet their friendship lingered, even earning her a place at our wedding. Now, that very connection reared its treacherous head. Though the situation had always struck me as odd, he had once reassured me that their past was nothing more than a closed chapter, merely a friendship reserved for group gatherings and sporadic travels. I had never thought that such benign familiarity could one day be my salvation. Confronted with the undeniable truth of their affair, I resolved then and there to shatter our marital vows. I called a trusted friend, who swiftly connected me with a divorce attorney, a man well acquainted with the pain of a broken marriage from his own experience. I recounted every sordid detail to the lawyer and demanded that divorce papers be drafted immediately. Simultaneously, a gnawing intuition drove me to schedule a fertility test, convinced that I was not at fault and that his excuses were nothing but hollow lies. Within a week, I filed the petition for divorce on grounds of infidelity, and my test results arrived with a resounding verdict: my fertility was flawless, leaving no room for his excuses. Every dark suspicion was validated, and a fierce impatience burned within me. I longed for his return so that I might hurl the divorce papers at him and sever our bond without hesitation. I immersed myself in busy distractions during those turbulent days, leaving no time for tears or regret. My sole aim was to imprint an indelible lesson upon his soul. On the 11th day of his absence, he reappeared, cloaked in a veneer of casual normalcy. He offered a meager apology for our earlier clash and mentioned that he had been researching fertility treatments, suggesting, almost casually, that we try one such intervention. Without indulging in idle conversation, I pressed him directly: "Where have you been hiding for these 10 days?" He fumbled, insisting he couldn't recall the hotel's name, a hesitation that betrayed guilt. I even mentioned the hotel by name, and he attempted to brush it off. Undeterred, I cited the incriminating Instagram post from his ex, a coincidence too striking to ignore. My relentless silence, punctuated by a piercing stare that lasted nearly 8 minutes, finally compelled him to break down. He admitted he had met her, but not the full sordid tale, claiming he had hidden it to protect my feelings. Demanding every last detail, I refused to let him dodge my questions. At length, he confessed that their meeting had escalated into intimacy, a desperate act born purely of frustration. He revealed that, on the eve of his departure, he had summoned her to the hotel. His stated intent was to confirm if the infertility was his fault, a painful memory from college when a breakup had been marred by an accidental pregnancy. Yet, when pressed, she admitted her own betrayal, hinting that the child might not have been his at all. Crushed by this revelation, he had yearned to rush home, but her persuasive allure had anchored him in that hotel, and in a moment of utter despair, he surrendered to his baser impulses. In a disturbingly calm tone, he rationalized his actions as if they were logical. He had chosen the secret rendezvous over the terror of clinical testing, arguing that a covert meeting to probe an old pregnancy misadventure was far less intimidating than confronting a definitive diagnosis, and that intimacy, in that twisted moment, was simply more convenient. He went on to claim that once he learned the terminated pregnancy from college might not have been his fault, he sought hospital tests, only to discover that the true barrier to conception lay with him, not with me. Moreover, he admitted that he'd been exploited. Her presence at the hotel had been fleeting, a mere 5 days out of a 10-day trip. After that, she had vanished, breaking promises of continued contact. The single night they shared was nothing more than a momentary lapse, not the emotional reconciliation he had so desperately craved. He apologized, calmly asserting that his actions were driven solely by frustration and an overwhelming longing for a family, and then, with a disturbingly casual tone, insisted that he was willing to salvage our marriage, framing it as his decision alone. At that moment, I burst into bitter laughter, a sound so raw and jagged that it persisted until I slid the divorce papers and my pristine fertility results across the table. As he floundered, insisting that all this was unnecessary and that we could still make things work, I remained silent. My bags were already packed, and every word of our conversation had been recorded on my phone, ensuring that my exit was irrevocable. After he had recounted the sordid details of his ill-fated trip, I knew that no further argument was worth my energy. I turned on my heel and left without a backward glance. He sank to his knees, pleading desperately for forgiveness when he realized I was gone for good. But I was unmoved. I gathered my belongings, stepped into my car, and drove off, leaving him sobbing in the front yard of what was once our home. I journeyed to a friend's safe haven, a dear college companion whose address my husband never knew, ensuring I'd remain unreachable. For nearly 3 days, his daily texts went unanswered, a defiant silence in the face of his sorrow. Then, unexpectedly, a call came from my in-laws. My mother-in-law, in a tempest of emotion, demanded that I return his calls and respond to his desperate messages. Panic surged as I interrogated her, learning that my husband had phoned her in a torrent of sobs, repeating over and over that, without me, life was meaningless, that his dreams of a family were forever shattered. His hysteria had escalated to the point where she feared he might harm himself, pleading for an immediate callback. The very thought of it stung with cruelty. His laments seemed designed solely to guilt-trip me for protecting myself, actions any self-respecting woman in my position would take. He was now casting himself as the wounded victim, all because of his own infertility. So instead of reaching out, I told his mother he was free to do as he wished. I was no longer his wife after his betrayal. Her shocked protest that I was being heartless barely registered. I coldly insisted that he deserved every ounce of this retribution, then ended the call, determined not to waste another moment on his sorrow. An hour later, another text arrived. I read it with a numb detachment. He claimed he was finally feeling better and suggested that I respond only if I wished to. Yet he went on to accuse me of heartlessness, asserting that my reaction proved I'd never truly loved him. He pleaded for me to understand that he, too, was suffering, that his infertility condemned him to a life without children, and therefore, I should have shown him kindness. Thus, I remained unmoved, standing firm in my decision to protect myself, even as his mother's desperate words echoed about his mental collapse following his infidelity. Update 1. 3 days have passed since my initial outpouring, and I must thank everyone who reached out with support and kindness during this maelstrom. In hindsight, I realize I should have severed ties the moment he began shifting blame for our failure to conceive. Yet, I am not one to surrender my heart without undeniable proof that a bond is unworthy, a verdict he sealed with his betrayal. I refused to return his calls, for there was no merit in being manipulated by guilt trips orchestrated by him and his mother. My own suffering, intensified by the shock of being cheated on and losing my marriage in a single day, meant that his claims of victimhood were nothing more than a farcical attempt to twist sympathy in his favor. So forgive me if I am not quick to forget or to extend forgiveness as if nothing had happened. His relentless texts have been muted, his latest accusations of cruelty unheeded. He may have a couple of weeks to respond to the divorce petition, and I suspect he'll scramble to cancel it, trying every trick to persuade me otherwise. But he does not know that I have already relinquished all hope in our union. His desperate appeals are now as futile as they are misguided. I might have pardoned the infertility, knowing it was not my fault, and perhaps even overlooked his poor behavior, but I can never forgive him for the act of cheating. Update 2. Today, I reluctantly returned to our old home after realizing I had left behind a priceless bracelet, a treasured gift from my father. In my disoriented state, it was a grave oversight to forsake something so dear. I had hoped to choose a moment when he wouldn't be present, yet I resolved to face the place after work, indifferent to the possibility of an encounter. At the door, he greeted me with an overly eager smile and reached out for an embrace, oblivious to the fact that my face was devoid of any warmth. I firmly pushed him away, telling him coldly that I was there solely to retrieve my jewelry, and nothing more. He looked crestfallen, accusing me of heartlessness and insisting that this was just one minor incident, that I should simply forgive and move on, reminding me that he had confessed his transgressions in person. The intensity of my anger nearly drove me to strike him, yet I swallowed the urge, dismissing his meaningless babble. He continued to babble about having severed all contact with his ex, claiming it was entirely his decision. He insisted that had circumstances been different, he would have happily maintained their connection. But fate had revealed all. When I finally clutched the small box containing my bracelet, ready to depart for good, he blocked my exit. Standing tall in the doorway, his imposing presence sent a chill through me as he demanded one last chance to explain himself. Cornered with no escape, I listened as he repeated his tired refrain, that his infidelity was born out of frustration, not desire, and that he never truly cared for her, accusing her of having used him. He insisted that his ex had, paradoxically, made him realize how deeply he loved me, swearing that he was unwilling to relinquish our marriage without a fight, needing only one more chance to prove his worth. Reluctantly, I granted him that final, ironic chance, not out of forgiveness, but simply to have an excuse to leave. I told him I would think it over, a feeble promise that seemed to lift his spirits momentarily. As he reached out once more in a final embrace, I pushed him away, jumped into my car, and sped off, eager to put as much distance as possible between us. I returned home half an hour later, still simmering with anger that he dares believe he deserves a second chance after his treachery. I know he will contest the divorce, but it matters little. I possess irrefutable evidence of his betrayal, and it frustrates me that he remains blind to the true horror of his actions. No one deserves a second chance after such devastation. He had once shifted blame onto me for our failure to conceive, making me feel utterly worthless, even though the real fault lay with him. In my heart, I know this divorce could have come much sooner. Update 3. My husband now has 1 week to respond to the divorce petition, yet I sense he clings to a desperate hope that I might change my mind, even though I have ignored his calls and texts for what feels like ages. Today, I sent him a stark message. He cannot sway my decision, so he'd better begin finding a lawyer, for neither his time nor mine is worth wasting further. He called, questioning if I was truly resolute, and I confirmed with finality that there is no chance in hell I will take him back after what he's done. His attempts to dissuade me fell on exhausted ears. I ended the call with nothing left to say. The ball is now in his court, while my lawyer and I are already strategizing the settlement to ensure he bears the consequences of his actions. Update 4, he's chosen not to contest the divorce. Now we are barreling straight into settlement negotiations. I expect a fair, generous division of our assets, bolstered by the damning evidence I hold. Though he has not contacted me since our last call, his mother has been busy. She didn't call me directly but instead reached out to my parents, railing against the idea that I could be disloyal for refusing to give him another chance. Apparently, she expected me to overlook one minor mistake and forgive him, blissfully unaware that my parents stand firmly against any excuse for infidelity. In the end, she received a stern rebuke, forced to accept that her son is the one who has truly erred. If anyone, her fury should be aimed at him, not me, for I have merely chosen to do what is right for myself. I take solace in my parents' unwavering support, and soon my friends will know the truth. I refuse to hide the betrayal that has reshaped my life. Everyone deserves to know what he did, while the issue of infertility fades into insignificance. After a long period of bottled-up emotions, I now feel a liberating release stirring within me, a quiet promise that soon, I will be divorced and free from his shadow forever.